gratitude goes out to the organizers, to Murat Aslan in particular, but also to all the institutions participating. I think this is a very interesting group. It is always added value for us to see the perspectives too from every country, every institution that is represented here. So without further ado, we will begin with the first presentation of this third panel by Ercan Seyhan. He is a senior explosive expert, and he is specializing specifically in post-blast investigation. And he has been doing so for more than 13 years. He has taken that to an academic endeavor as well, I might say. And the topic of his contribution today is improvised explosive devices, IEDs, as we've often heard of, threat evaluations and countermeasures in future conflicts. I'm very interested to hear your thoughts and your analysis. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Before starting to my presentation, I want to convey my thanks to especially Mr. Murat Aslan and the organizers and to all participants. Today, I will try to give some brief information about the improvised explosive devices. And the second part, I'll try to make some threat evaluation. And the third part, I'll try to give a summary of the countermeasures in future conflicts, which are mostly the experience-based countermeasures. Can I share my screen? Yeah. The terrorist use of handmade explosive devices mostly aim to create a support base for the social and behavioral changes in public. The strategic impact potential, which is based on the sudden and the cumulative effects of IEDs, I mean improvised explosive devices, make them as a tactic frequently preferred by the terrorist organizations due to their low cost, easy production, and ability to create a symbolic effect. However, what should not be forgotten about the improvised explosive devices is the existence of the long-term and effective symbolic qualities within the scope of strategic and tactic impact potential. It can be said easily that the improvised explosive devices are the very melting point of the tactical and strategic targets of the terrorism. These weapons allow them, to the terrorists, to set the agenda at the strategic level, both in their political and the socio-psychological sphere of influence. If it's fact that the terrorism will also take new measures for the operational effectiveness of the, each IEDs, improvised explosive devices countermeasures. So it should be evaluated quantitatively and also qualitatively. And new analytical methods should be established for the countermeasures, because every measure is against a new tactic used by the terrorists for the IEDs. The most important and foremost is using violence to create political influence is the target for the improvised explosive devices which are used by the terrorists. So let me try to give some sources for the characteristics of the terrorism before starting to give the explanation about the improvised explosive devices. The most important and foremost specialty for the improvised explosive devices and the terrorism is using violence to create political influence. And the second one is, it's a pre-planned systematic act. And the third fact is the terrorists cannot be limited by the established war rules. And the final one, the fourth one, is the long-term psychological and socio-psychological effects created by terrorism and improvised explosive devices. The terrorist actions using violence and force aim at pressuring and intimidating the society by directly targeting people and the public properties. Terrorists use handmade explosive devices and aim to create support base for their social behavioral changes in the public. So that's why their side effects, but in fact, the main effect is social psychological effect, which is long run. And in this way, it aims to weaken the state's authority. Terrorist organizations mostly want to show they have effective means of force using with different strategies. They also aim to maximize the political and social psychological effects of the bombings. The strategic goal desired to be achieved by the improvised explosive devices is to force the authority, I mean the governments and the states, to make changes in their national policies while obtaining financial resources and gaining new supporters from the society. The success of the improvised explosive devices in creating optimum results on the target is, that's why, quite high. The cumulative effects that can be obtained on the target and the sum of the instant effects, which are sensational effects, are interpreted as the cornerstones of the terrorism in achieving their goals. Explosives used for the terrorist purposes. The tool is the improvised explosive devices are perceived as the symbolic indicator of the terrorist organization's strength. The ID attacks on critical structures, civilians, military units try to create a perception that the political authority, the states, the governments cannot control society, so they are weak. It's aimed at the atmosphere of fear, panic, which is tried to be created in society, also create extreme sensitivity and reaction in the political authority. IEDs are accepted by definition as, because mostly it's under discussion all around the world, what IED is. Today, we conclude as the explosive experts that the terrorists are able to create even deadly weapons, improvised deadly weapons. Today, we also talk about that in many parts of the world, and some evaluations are being carried out. One is the dirty bombs. That's why let's start with the IED's definition, then I will make an evaluation, overall evaluation. The IEDs are accepted by definition as they are explosive devices made manually or by fabrication methods to assemble and place chemical, pyrotechnic, incendiary, lethal and damaging materials manufactured to kill, destroy, damage, deform, attract attention, and harass. So my deduction is they've got the capacity to provide, to design chemical, biological, and also radiological improvised explosive devices. I want to make a short and summary threat evaluation about the improvised explosive devices. The terrorists can operate in foreign countries as well as in their countries they live in or other countries. Their financial resources and the logistic support cannot be limited by the borders of any country, and the flow of money to them cannot be stopped via economic sanctions or the embargoes. In addition, they use today the very advanced technologies to carry out their mission. I mean, for the improvised explosive devices. Terrorists try to place a sense of insecurity by creating psychological pressure on the public who try to fulfill their daily life requirements. Uncertainty is the main purpose of the brutal target of terrorism. This uncertainty is usually achieved by using explosives, and the most popular one is improvised explosive devices, because men can face the danger they know, but the unknown always scares people. There are few impulses stronger than any irregular violence and fear. That's why terrorism is effective in society in negative way mostly. The IED's final impact is based on two main focuses. These foci can be defined as the main targets and the aftershock effects, which are the psychological and social psychological effects. I mean, when both objectives are achieved, the results create both tactical and strategical effects also. These effects are caused not only by the tactical and strategical values of the target, but by the psychological and social psychological effects created on the public and political platform. Therefore, it can be easily said, and I can easily say that IEDs are asymmetric effect-based weapon that penetrates social, psychological, and physical grounds. Linear effects are proportional and predictable effects. However, non-linear effects are disproportionate effects that cannot be measured and predicted easily. In this context, improvised explosive devices, simple, really and relatively small, but equally very complex, and large non-linear attack tools. IEDs can create social psychological effect in wider societal area than the three-dimensional physical plane they target, and their effects will survive for decades after the explosion happens. Here, I want to show some statistical facts about the improvised explosive devices. The improvised explosive devices have become a great danger in many parts of the world by hindering security, political and social stability, humanitarian aid, and sustainable development programs. In the last decade, nearly 60 countries have been affected by IEDs at varying rates. Statistical data show that 59% of all the terrorist attacks between 2011 and 2015 were caused by improvised explosive materials, and approximately 70,000 civilian casualties or deaths were experienced with these improvised explosive device attacks. And this number continues constitutes approximately 85% of the terrorist-related losses. In other words, improvised explosive devices are trying to reach the level of being a universal monster, as if trying to prove that no place on earth is safe. IEDs have become a weapon that requires urgent action to maintain both socio-economic and socio-psychological stability all over the world, because the destructive effects of the improvised explosive devices on security and stability can be very severe. It's obvious. IEDs, of which one of them, their main objectives is to hinder the effectiveness and the mobility of the security forces to fulfill their duties, routine duties, also aim to create trauma in society, to reduce the trust in the political authority and the state. One of the ultimate goals of the terrorist organizations is to create feeling of insecurity by creating the perception that the society and the public infrastructures are not adequately protected by the governments and the states. So, after making a brief and summary of the evaluation, I want to give some recommendations and also some possible experience-based countermeasures. The academic studies dealing with providing answers for the problems of real life, as we know, are called and considered applied research. This kind of research is sometimes more powerful than the basic research, since they deal with conditions of everyday life and has the potential to provide useful findings and the conclusions for practitioners in addition to academicians. Within this frame, experience-based lessons drawn can be evaluated as one of the most significant methods to reach solutions for difficult problems. I mean, improvised explosive device. That's why I call it the new era's monster. The size of the socio-political influence level of the improvised explosive devices also makes them a more inclusive and preferred weapon among all types of terrorist organizations. Because of the goal of the terrorism is not only to cause casualties, but also to serve the continuity of the fear and instability by disrupting social psychology. Therefore, there is a constant relationship, I can say, between the countermeasures taken by the security forces against the IEDs and the development of the IED tactics by the terrorist actions. There are some general steps. We call these the rings of the improvised explosive threat chain, followed by all the terrorist organizations before an IED attack took place and carried out by the terrorists. There are some stages of obtaining financial support and construction materials. They have to do that. And studying the technique to be used because they want it to be 100% successful. And the constructing the IEDs. Before constructing IEDs, they have to find the financial support, construction materials, and the techniques to be used, and they make some rehearsals. And determining the target, they have to choose a target which must be optimum for them and a strategic, enough strategic to be chosen and sending the IT to the target. The last phase is the sending IDs to the target and carrying out the attack. Mostly our law enforcement officers and law enforcement agencies and the military is dealing with in the last phase. All these resources that terrorism needs can be considered intelligence inputs for possible countermeasures. I mean, the financial support, construction materials, techniques to be used, and all the support in the social base. If each input is evaluated very well, it's valuable information for the security forces and the law enforcement forces that will indicate the possible improvised explosive device attack. The most appropriate measure to be taken for an ID are that the security forces should have sound intelligence at each of these stages and break the rings of the ID threat chain with a proactive approach before the attack takes place. These are more robust systematic inferences, and we can make this when the information provided by both sources, I mean human-based and technology-based intelligence. There are detectable signs of an attack at every stage of an ID threat. So the data supported by the crime statistics and the crime mapping. Here, there are two important issues, which are the statistics and also the crime mapping. Systematic crime mapping will eliminate the possibility of improvised explosive device use, I believe. And also many ID countermeasures to prevent ID actions occurrence are operationally based. However, the main thing is and must be, the main thing must be the deterrence provided by the information of the proactive measures through general crime prevention strategies, which is one of the main subject of criminology and the input provided by the forensic sciences. The social psychological impact of the ID attacks will manifest itself on the axis of social support and social discontent. Therefore, I can say different cultural, social, and the political approaches in places where the actions are expected or occur allow the establishment of important precautionary parameters about improvised explosive device attacks. It will be possible to prevent terrorism from agitating these values as if they were social support of ID attacks. The ID threat assessment should also include not only regional analysis, but also the international attacks analysis. It's important to determine here the similarities and the differences between the experiences gained from attacks and the events that occurred afterwards. All kinds of data also obtained today can be stored on automatic databases, which are DNI databases, AFIS, or some computer forensics and fingerprints and palm prints. So it's important here to issue that, to ensure the integration of this correct data obtained from different sources with the existing data in the databases. These databases must and should have the ability to communicate among each other for a proactive IED threat, minimizing. Establishing countermeasures is an active process and requires efficient field and human intelligence. So it's also very important to evaluate the evidentiary intelligence that can be obtained from the events that occurred. I'm almost finishing, but I want to stress once more here for the evidence intelligence for the IEDs, because every IED leaves some traces for the future, occurrences for the improvised explosive device. That's why if we can get good evidence intelligence, if we can read those precursors which are stationed on the remnants of the improvised explosive devices, we can make a very true and deductions for the future possible improvised explosive device actions. And active and passive detection systems are among the most effective physical countermeasures that can be created against IEDs. Before finishing up, I intentionally put the physical countermeasure at the end, but it's the main and the crux center of all the countermeasures. For a better fight against improvised explosive devices needs basically physical countermeasures that are being carried out by the states. This is all for my side, and I want to thank all the participants and the organizers for providing us this stage. Thank you very much. And if you have any question, I'm ready to answer with my pleasure.
Thank you, Professor Seyhan. It's very interesting. IEDs are a topic that, for me personally, they play a role in a lot of developments that we follow, but it's a very insightful presentation that you gave for us to better understand some of the details and some of the factors that are at play. So thank you very much. I think in this setting, it is probably a good idea to leave the discussion and Q&A to the end of the panel. So unless there's any urgent business from some of the participants, questions, I would propose that we move to Dr. Pelin Aliyev, our next speaker. She, as I should have mentioned for Professor Seyhan, is of Hasan Kalyoncu University, and she will give us the presentation today on the impact of the Ukraine-Russian war on Africa, with a particular focus on food security. So another issue that I assume most of us have in some way, shape or form read about, heard some points of analysis about over the past month, but I'm looking forward to have a concise wrap up of the impacts. So Dr. Aliyev, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our conference. I am very pleased to be here. I'm Dr. Pelin Aliyev from Hasan Kalyoncu University. As you can see on the screen, my topic today is the effects of Russia-Ukraine war on food security in Africa. In my presentation, I will focus on how this war affects food security in African continents. As you know very well, in the early hours of 24 February, Russia launched a comprehensive military operation against Ukraine, and the war has resulted in civilian casualties and injuries, the destruction of critical infrastructure and massive displacement, and more than, unfortunately, 7.8 million people had to leave their homes and migrate across borders to other countries in search of safety. Since the beginning of these hostilities, nearly 1/3 of Ukrainians have been forced from their homes. This is, again, unfortunately, one of the largest human displacement crises in the world today. Furthermore, within Ukraine, over 6.2 million people remain displaced by the war. political, social, and economic life was deeply affected in the country. And on the other hand, the impacts of the war, however, went beyond this and caused a global food crisis. This war brought food security to the agenda of international politics. Food security refers to a situation in which all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food to meet their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. Food is the first basic human need and fundamental right of every human being, having constitutional guarantees in almost all countries. However, contemporary food systems constantly are influenced by both internal and external stressors caused by nature-induced changes, socioeconomic shocks, and geopolitical conflicts, because these systems are globalized. And this war and armed conflict weaken the ability of nations, households, and individuals to meet their food needs. And research indicates that the wars and armed conflicts are the main causes of food insecurity in the world. Russia's war against Ukraine has highly impacted especially food security. These two countries are among the leading players in the global trade of food and agricultural products. However, although the war lost only between these two countries, its effects are globally, and this led to a worldwide food crisis. In addition, it is anticipated that the continuation of the war will create great difficulties for many countries, especially those dependent on food imports, like some African countries. Africa is the continent most affected by the war-induced food crisis. In fact, many African countries were already fragile in terms of food security before the war started, roughly 10 times the size of India and 3 times the size of China. It is home to nearly 18% of the world's population and roughly 30% of its mineral resources, with an average per capita GDP of just over $2,000. However, it remains the poorest continent by far. Of the 46 countries the United Nations has rated as the least developed, 35 are African countries. More than 3/4 of the continent's population lives in countries where life expectancy, income, and education are well below the global mean. And Africa, as the Ghanaian diplomat Kofi Annan once said, is a rich continent with many poor people, and the growing imbalance between supply and demand in recent years has caused global food prices to rise. As you can see in the table, Sub-Saharan Africa is the region where people spend the most on food by their individual income in 2017. In 2023, it is predicted that Sub-Saharan Africa will maintain this leadership, unfortunately. And the COVID-19 pandemic has played an important role in exacerbating this imbalance. Before the Russia-Ukraine war, international food prices reached an all-time high. In addition, the negative reflections of internal and external conflicts and climate change on the agricultural production process in the continent can be clearly seen. About 20% of people in Africa face chronic hunger, compared to only 10% globally. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization estimated that over 280 million Africans suffer from hunger. This is a higher proportion of people affected by food insecurity than in any other region in the world. Moreover, African countries rely heavily on the international market to meet needs of their ever-growing population, and it is estimated that over 80% of food consumed domestically in recent years was imported from outside the continent. The majority of African countries are heavily dependent on food imports, especially wheat from Russia and Ukraine, to meet the demand of domestic markets. For instance, both Benin and Somalia obtained all their wheat from Ukraine and Russia. In 2019 and 2020, the dependency of Egypt, Sudan, Congo, Senegal, and Tanzania on Russian and Ukrainian wheat imports stood at 82%, 75%, 69%, 66%, and 64% respectively. The war emerged as an additional shock to Africa's food systems that threatened to disrupt the already fragile food supply chains, exacerbates food security challenges, and various international organizations frequently warn about the severe famine in Africa and emphasize that urgent measures should be taken. When the negative repercussions of the war are added to all these factors, the alarm bells regarding food security are ringing even more intensely for Africa, unfortunately. The Russia-Ukraine war has further exacerbated food insecurity, especially for low-income countries on the continent. Moreover, combined with poverty, scarcity of natural resources, the effects...
Hala ilgileniyorum.
The effects of climate change, the issue of food security has the potential to trigger resources of instability such as conflict and migration. In many African countries, socio-political unrest has traditionally coincided with periods of high and volatile food prices. Evidence shows that disruption to food supply chain and spikes in domestic food prices severely deteriorate the social and economic well-being of the vulnerable population groups and could result in dramatic rioting. This is often termed food riots. These often been associated with an increased probability of social and political unrest. Thus, the impact of the Russia-Ukraine war on food supply and food price inflation could inflame conflict, destabilize government, and cause violence to spill over borders. These potential results should not be taken lightly, because these are very crucial for African future. And this is my key point, that food security is an important priority in, of course, in almost every country, but it is a more crucial issue for African countries. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aliyev. That was very interesting, very good compilation of the way that the war has affected particularly African countries in their food security. Again, if there are any very urgent questions that you cannot wait to get out of into the discussion, please do so now. Otherwise, I would suggest that we also take care of that in the Q&A later and move on to our third presentation in this panel by the professors Cenker, Korhan, Demir, and Burçin, Uluğ. And both of them also from the Hasan Kalyoncu University. Professor Demir has a PhD in International Security and Terrorism, and Professor Uluğ in International Relations. And the topic, very close to both of their PhD disciplines of their talk, will be the clash of theories in the context of the war in Ukraine, how to account for competing policies of major actors. And the competing part, I think, is something that as observers, we've all been scratching our heads about at times over the past months. So please enlighten us and tell us a little bit more about your analysis on this. The floor is yours.
Would I have an screen access, please, for my PowerPoint presentation?
You have it. You have it. You can share it.
No, I can't now. I'm just trying. All right, now.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Good evening to everyone. This is Burçin Uluğ from Hasan Kalyoncu Universities, and warm greetings to my session chair, Benedict, and other participants, and also the other audience. Before starting, let me express my gratitude to the organization committee, but particularly my colleague, Dr. Murat Aslan, for inviting me to this distinguished gathering. And also, warm thanks to my co-author, Dr. Cenker Korhan Demir, for his collaboration and valuable insights in making this presentation possible. Basically, the major purpose of the major purpose of my talk is to situate the outbreak of Russia-Ukraine conflict through the analytical lenses provided by realist and liberal theories of IR, and shedding light on major powers' responses to this conflict, including China, US, and the EU. And now it is maybe worth mentioning that this presentation is also will be limited by the concepts by each of the theories raised in the study. Actually, in a world full of infinite complexity and ambiguity, we assume that stock of IR theories, particularly realism and liberalism, can assist to make sense of and reduce such complexity surrounding the ongoing crisis. At the risk of here oversimplifying the rich and diverse tradition of thought, I mean, I'm talking about, realism, and troubling events in Ukraine have just confirmed enduring relevance of the realist perspective, particularly with its explanatory concepts such as security dilemma, relevance of hard power, and self-help system, anarchic world, alliance politics, and act of balancing. Realist theories actually portray an anarchical environment where there is no central authority superior to states to guarantee their compliance with laws and rules and to protect them from each other. That is, no doubt, UN is not a substitute for world government in this sense, and states can never ensure that a dangerous state might not threaten them in the future. Therefore, they are just forced to worry about their own security and compete for power to ensure survival in self-help environments. States are therefore better off taking a strong interest in relative power relations with other states. In such an Hobbesian and conflictual international realm, as Thucydides set forth once upon a time, the strong do what they will, the weak suffer what they must. As such, realism points out the limits of the efficiency of the rules and norms in international order. In other words, dialogue, diplomacy, or moral condemnation are just discredited for resolving interstate disputes. As shown by the diplomatic and mediator efforts by Guterres, Macron, and Erdogan to reach a solution through dialogue were just watered down, which have been demonstrated in many twists and turns in the ceasefire talks so far. Another classical realist concept, security dilemma, arises when a state's guest for security ends up making its adversary less secure, who in turn makes investment in its own security by seeking allies or purchasing more weapons, thereby breeding suspicions and leading to an escalatory spiral. And this makes sense for Eastern Europe's desire to get into NATO, given their long-term suspicions of Russia. Likewise, widespread military aid and supplies from the West to Ukraine since 2014 underline her security dilemma against Russia. On the other hand, enlargement of the EU across the former Soviet countries also contributed to the escalation of insecurity perception of Russia as well. No doubt, open-ended NATO enlargement began in 1990s, particularly offering to the former Soviet countries like Georgia and Ukraine under Moscow's regional sphere of influence at least theoretical chance to join NATO. So the US, by doing so, the US triggered a security dilemma with Russia. Given these circumstances, then, as most realists argued, Russia responded with invasions of Georgia in 2008, Crimea in 2014, and eastern part of Ukraine recently in 2022. And more recently, we know that Russia has cut gas deliveries to Bulgaria and Poland, escalated its conflict with the EU, and threatened to use nuclear weapons as well. As a consequence of such an aggression in Ukraine, the NATO allies agreed at their meeting in Madrid in 2022, and they declared Russia as the most significant and direct threat to their security and peace. So the US, Europe, and other countries supported Ukrainians' armed resistance by providing military equipment and supplies. So these vindicates the relevance of hard power in solving state disputes as the only means to confront the illegal use of force. And this tragedy in Ukraine, in turn, has led Euro-Atlantic West to counteract with a vocal and comprehensive package of sanctions, reducing imports of Russian energy and stepping up weapon deliveries to Ukraine. And the ongoing war has made European countries aware of Russia as an imminent threat to them. And this explains why they are seeking to build up their relative power balance with Kremlin. NATO, on the other hand, being deprived of its raison d'etre, has been given a remarkably renewed push, and this vindicates also a realist understanding of alliance politics once again. Realist display of balancing act against Russian assertive policy can be observed in the broken neutrality of some countries. The most vivid example being Switzerland's policy of bandwagoning to the EU in its sanction imposing process, applications of Sweden and Finland for NATO membership, as well as several European powers, including Germany, for their decision to increase military spendings. On the other end of the spectrum comes Chinese authorities. Actually, China has endorsed Russia diplomatically, and Chinese authorities blamed the US and NATO for bringing Russia-Ukraine rift to a critical point and attempting to contain Russia and China. And China presents a vivid example of an act of balancing with Russia against the Western-led international order. If Russia can reach its objectives in Ukraine, China will most probably follow the suit by taking steps to reunify with Taiwan and assert a claim over the South China Sea. So the US, therefore, on its part, opposed Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 and Russian support for the two breakaway republics in Donbass. Biden boosted military assistance for Ukraine, endorsed Ukrainian insurgency, persuaded hesitant European states such as Hungary and Cyprus to follow the suit and to join stronger sanctions on the part of the West. Even though Russia's invasion of Ukraine has vindicated such realist assumptions that I mentioned, it still remains far-fetched to provide a whole story for us. First, as defensive realist Stephen Walt asserts, realism depiction of state as billiard ball and rational actor fails to account for miscalculation and misperception of leadership as being imperfect human beings due to psychological, cultural, and other bureaucratic reasons. For instance, Putin underestimated Ukrainian robust reaction, overrated his own army's ability to declare a swift and costless victory, and miscalculated how the West was likely to respond. Second, realists underestimated the role of norms as constraints over state behavior. Yet norms may have an explanatory power in portraying international community's reaction to the use of force against Westphalian statehood and rule-based liberal democratic international order whose principles underwritten in the UN Charter. So persistent violations of international and humanitarian law may have an impact on the judgment of others and stepping up efforts of individuals, companies, corporations, and states to further ostracize Russia. Third, realism appears to ignore the relevance of domestic political settings, leaving aside second image accounts to explain state behavior, ranging from Putin's worldview, his own political calculations at home, also particular national identity arguments, self-understandings of historical narratives, Russian political elite, sense of threat by the color revolutions. So turning to liberal theory, our second theory to account for the invasion and Russian foreign policy and the foreign policies of others, the most influential rival school to realism is liberal theory. And it's, as a political philosophy, can be even traced back to the Enlightenment thinkers of Kant, Bentham, and Locke, among others. And this is a tradition addressing the problems of achieving lasting peace and cooperation and maintaining that human reason could deliver justice and freedom in international relations. This is a diverse approach to world politics and has various sub-theories actually inside it: liberal internationalism, institutionalism, economic interdependence, democratic peace theory. And as a diverse approach and a guide to foreign policy, core of this liberal theories, core assumptions can be put forward. For example, they have a strong faith in human capability and human reason, and it's possible through that, it's possible to overcome obstacles of international anarchy, so the anarchy can be mitigated. The rules, international organizations, and international law might have power to discourage and limit aggressive foreign policies. And secondly, and very in contrast to realists, liberals transcend internal-external divide and emphasizes pivotal role of internal processes of state. And for them, in other words, state-society relations, ideology, regime type, system of government have explanatory power for how a state acts in international relations. Thirdly, some liberals assert that increased economic interdependence due to trade and financial interactions between states may lead to incentives for peace and cooperation, thereby reducing the likelihood of conflict and war. And fourthly, international institutions, organizations, regimes are significant facilitators in shaping interstate relations, state preferences, and choices. And they may enhance stability, they may enhance trust, encourages cooperative habits, monitoring compliance, and sanctions defectors. So actually building on these fundamental premises that I presented, this talk actually maintains that liberalism's pitfalls, drawbacks have come to the forefront actually in some respects. For instance, international law and international institutions have been unable to deter a predatory use of hard power, hard military power, and illegal invasion exercised by Russia. Short of being a alleviating force or a sort of a world government, the UN itself was unable to prevent this aggression or act upon invasion of Ukraine, apart from UN General Assembly's emergency special session condemning the invasion and calling for an immediate withdrawal of Russian forces by an overwhelming majority of 141-5 with 35 abstentions. Put differently, major shortcoming of liberal theory stem from its underestimation of conventional power-based measures in reaching out peace under anarchy. And lastly, but not leastly, economic interdependence hardly stopped Russian tanks, despite the considerable cost that it will be inflicted upon as a result. So it brought a question, therefore, to the fore: which actor is more dependent or has the endurance in overcoming the problems more than the other? So in spite of the weaknesses, liberalism seems to be fruitful as well in portraying the West's determined and rapid reaction to protect economic and political values of the US-led rule-based international order that is presently being challenged. And finally, although international institutions can hardly settle major conflicts, they can still facilitate more effective responses when states' interests are mostly aligned. And secondly, West's response, in view of the West's response to the invasion, liberal concept of economic interdependence help us understand pervasive sanctions imposed on Russia. Indeed, US, UK, and many other European countries, plus Japan, have resorted to respective sanctions against Russian banks, businesses, politicians, with regard to their financial assets, investments, trade activities. So given that Russia is tightly entrenched in such a complex interdependency in the post-Cold War era, it's believed that sanctions would not only further ostracize Russia, but would eventually inflict adverse effects on its economy as well. And this would in turn, it's believed that this would in turn prompt Russian leadership to back down, or would even drive Russian people, citizens, to rebel against their government due to constraints and frustrations felt at home. And we are now maybe left to conclude that no single theory, as you can see, adequately explain Russian aggression per se. Rather, refraining from analytical eclecticism, it's observed that different theories emphasize different aspects of this phenomena. Thus, a weakness of one theory can be a strength of the other. Practically, looking at what's going on on the ground, any sort of negotiated settlement still appears to be a long way, and any peace will highly likely to sow the seeds for future revanchism. Then the ultimate outcome will be contingent on several factors at play, such as the performance of Russian military, its resolve to resist harsh impacts of sanctions, the West's response, and above all, Ukrainians' capability and willingness to fight for a state and a nation that Putin believes does not and should not exist. And so this is a long game, and this is a massive reality of sort in Ukraine now. Therefore, we argue that and conclude that competing but complementary explanations of each theory, realism and or liberalism, will continue to provide a valuable structure for our minds, actually. And thank you for your time and patience.
Thank you very much, Professor Uluğ. I'm thinking back years and years ago at university. It was very early that you needed to understand that neither one of these theories is a catch-all concept necessarily, but it's, as you said, rather complementary, and it helps you understand certain aspects and maybe devise some patterns that help your analysis. Thank you for your insightful talk. We are now 3 for 3, so this is the time for Q&A. From the call here, are there any questions to these speakers? Is there anything that you thought needed clarification, that you wanted to reply to, or just a plain question, an interesting point?
Actually, I have a
Please
question
go ahead.
to Professor Burçin, because eclecticism is something really strange for me. In my first PhD proficiency examination, I failed. I said, I see theories, something that we can benefit, though. I prefer being an eclectic. And I failed, by the way. So is your research regarding, eclecticism a challenge to theoretical discussions, debates, or just a reflection of a reality? I mean, how do you see it? Thank you.
Thank you for your insightful question. Actually, theory is, as you all know, is there for simplifying the messy reality and provide some categorizations to structurize our mind maybe, and to explain only the one aspect, but not all of the story actually. And this is why I argued in this paper that actually no single theory can per se explain nor predict what's happening in Ukraine now. That's a sort of a complementary nature. They are rival, competing on the surface, but we need both of them to look through the one aspect of the reality, not all of them actually. That's why we need to refrain from such kinds of maybe eclecticism. Thank you.
Well, I had a hunch that you would come up with a question, Murat. This is very much your area of expertise. Are there any other questions from the participants? Seeing none, I have one for Dr. Aliyev. Are you with us still? Okay, in that case, I also have one for Professor Seyhan. And I was just wondering, so you've described very well what you would recommend, which measures, countermeasures could be taken. And I would be very curious to hear from your own experience, certainly in Turkey, but also with the years and years that you've been in the field, from existing approaches, existing countermeasures in different countries. Is there anything where you would point to and say that this is proven to be, in that particular context, to be fruitful? For instance, is there anything that you would, that is not an abstract recommendation, but where you can actually say, we're doing this already and this is a good idea, or some other country might be?
Yeah, these all the recommendations I'm giving, all experience-based, because we studied and experienced in the field for the PKK terrorism. So we produced some tactics for the countermeasures. So some of them are experienced in the field, so I conveyed those information to you. But some of them are only recommendations. We believe that, especially for the databases, okay? I'm trying to, put a remark on the evidence intelligence. If we can get a good evidence intelligence from the improvised explosive devices, and if we can match it with the data banks, okay, fingerprints, DNA, or others, then we can take some precautions for the future to be ID attacks. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the clarification. I have another question, unless there is somebody else. That's not the case. For Professor Uluğ again, and a lot of the things that you have alluded to, specifically to the complementarity of the theories, no single one individually explains everything. I was asking myself if you could elaborate on that particular case, maybe a little bit, looking at the definitions of peace that are currently also, whenever we talk, for instance, about this very particular war, but also in more general terms about conflicts, do we just see it as the absence of physical fighting? It's the very basic, classic definition of peace, or is it a much more far-reaching term where a lot of more factors come into play? I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Actually, are you asking this definition of peace and different approaches to peace according to realism or liberalism variants, or?
That would make sense
Generally.
for your presentation, of course. If you have any other input that you would like to refer to, please go ahead.
Actually, we approach to different theories, two rival schools, but since time and space limitations, and since the diverse nature of those, each of the theories, we have to just focus on predominant concepts of those each theories. And the peace was not the one of them that we focused on and researched on throughout our readings and writing. But we can say that as far as I know, the peace in liberal theories actually is not something freed from any conflict, but it's, you know, peace, tranquility, non-existence of hard military power. But in structural realism, for example, this is a kind of a stability. Maybe low intensity conflicts may there in order to even war may be there in order to make something rebalanced actually. For example, in Europe, there is an actual peace. There is no any, you know, conflict or war since 1960s. But for structural realists would argue that there would be some conflicts, skirmishes in order to balance the stability actually. There are differences in approach of peace actually in different theories.
Thank you very much. I believe we do have a question now from Professor Ahmet Gezer. Please.
Thank you, Benedict. I have a question to Professor Seyhan. So concerning the anti-air tank missiles, we know that in these missiles, depleted uranium is used, and in the past conflict regions, the residues or nodes staying in the region afterwards may leak to the water resources, and they are a threat for all the people, starting from the babies to child to all civilians. So what kind of precautions can be taken after the conflict in the Ukraine? Because we know that lots of tons of this kind of ammunition is used in that area, and we have a dirty land space in those areas. Thank you.
Thank you. The depleted uranium is an ongoing problem for the last 2 decades, especially starting from Iraq in Fallujah. There are lots of people, I mean, especially the women and the children, are getting cancer because of they are being thought that it's the depleted uranium is the main, I mean, reason for those kind of cancer issues, and also it's being used in Kosovo. So the same problem is still going on in Fallujah, Iraq, and Kosovo. You know, for the radioactive materials, the half-life is hundreds of years sometimes. When you make the depleted uranium, you know, put into somewhere, I mean, with a high speed munition, with high temperatures, so it will stay there hundreds of years. So in Ukraine case, you know, maybe we cannot clean it 100%. Nobody can do it, but we have to make the people be very well aware of the situation, and good education and training will be the curement for those people, because in the water cycle, okay, for hundreds of years, it will go up to the sky with the rains, it will rain down, so everywhere will be contaminated. So it's impossible to decontaminate all the places with depleted uranium, munitions, you know, remnants, but good education and training. And maybe it's a little bit hard, but banning the use of depleted uranium is the final point to do. But I am sure that it will not be pleased by some, countries and some companies, because mostly they use the depleted uranium. As you know, depleted uranium is U-235 to 238. Enriched uranium is 235. And the byproduct of the enriched uranium is the depleted uranium. So the specialty of the depleted uranium is it has got a sharpening effect on the munitions. It's not only used in the anti-tanks, it's also used for the anti-tank prevention from the munitions. So it's making the munitions hard and with pyrophoric. That's why they will use it anytime, and it's hard to stop them. But the best solution for my side to make some excellent centers for those countries, and we have to, the countries must educate and train their people for the depleted uranium reality. Thank you very much for the question.
Thank you, Professor Seyhan. In your answer, of course, very much intentionally, I assume you've also perfectly tied it again to the different presentation on the more realist and the more liberal approaches, because what you said at the very end would very much fit that distinction. Talking about whether to be able to prohibit weapons like that, or whether they will be used because they provide an advantage in the field. Are there any other questions from the participants? With that not being the case, I would close the panel. And if that is okay with you, Murat?
Thank you a lot, Benedict. It was really a pleasure and honor having you in here leading this panel. And I would like to thank my colleagues, Vlade, and the other colleagues that already left the room, because I know that it's nighttime in here. So now I'm closing.
Can I ask one little?
Say it again.
With your permission, the whole panel, thank you all very much indeed. One little question, Murat Hocam, to you. If you could just go over the conflicts, the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, as to Turkey's position, as to how it has handled the issue so far, and will perhaps do so in the coming months or so. Could you just touch on that sort of...
Me, right? Me?
Please, thank you.
Okay. So, Benedict, would you allow me, because you are the moderator of... Okay.
Of course.
Yeah. Okay, the Turkish policy towards Ukraine is actually double-edged. The first edge is about mediating the conflict. On the other hand, the other edge is it may seem a bit contradictory though, but it's about providing direct support to Ukraine's cause, because Turkey recognizes the integrity of Ukraine, including Crimea, along with the other European countries. On the other hand, there are some realities on the ground, especially in the Turkish current economic situation, geopolitical concerns and regional developments, because Turkey sees all the developments surrounding or in the vicinity of Turkey in a holistic manner. Something happens in Iran that does have a direct effect to Turkish security, but also may have an impact on mobilizing other threats. Syria, Iraq, Azerbaijan and Iran, Libya. So if you are facing a giant like Russia, there are some sort of, comments that Russia is short of sustaining this military conflict, though it does have strategic weapons. Turkey is challenging and facing and confronting and cooperating with Russia in Syria, in Libya. So there must be a process of managing the overall process. Otherwise, you may be included in a different sphere that you can't manage. And I think Turkey does not want it. On the other hand, mediation is the best way, first to hold the initiative. It's the prerequisite of, mediating in conflict resolution, as you know. The first advantage of any mediator, well, it's the political initiative. Just check Germany. They mediated Libya through the Berlin process and now really active. So I think Turkey just want to identify a smart route, not being included in the conflict directly, not a direct challenge to the actors. In the meantime, mediation. But for sure, if you ask me if it's sustainable or not, there's a certain point, if the water escalates more and more and more, Turkey will be pushed to select either way. In this case, I don't see Turkey be prone to Russian cause, but NATO's cause. Traditionally, Turkey relies the security concerns on the guarantees of NATO and contributes to NATO. So this is what I see. And currently, Turkey coordinates with NATO. So at this junction point, I believe, Turkish policy regarding Russian-Ukraine war, well, for me, it's a Russian aggression. It's something different in the frame of just war. I think Turkey will be committed to the Ukraine's cause and NATO's strategy, even though Turkey feels itself as a exit gate for Russia. This is the essence of the policy, I believe. Thank you. Your voice? We can't hear you. Okay.
Thank you, Murat. I might add at this point.
Thank you very much.
Might add at this point that it was, of course, also Turkey that has led the mediation efforts for food security, one of the topics of our panel today. For that to be, to a certain degree, taken out of the fighting and to be able to provide some much needed nutritional value to countries around the world. So I think now, after this last minute question, I think we are at the end of the panel. Thank you very much for participating. Thank you to all the speakers. I think it was a very interesting and insightful mix of topics, all of which were very pertinent to today's overall topic of the conference. Thanks again to the organizers, to all the participating institutions, and I yield the floor to dear Murat Aslan. You're still on mute.
So I want to yield to Professor Keser to conclude the conference. He is the chair of the department, so he can wrap up and, close the conference.
Thank you, Dr. Aslan. Murat, my colleague and classmate from the military academy as well. So we have a chance by working at least three classmates in one department. So thank you to Dr. Murat and all contributors from 7 countries for this conference to come into reality. So we have spoken on a very important and challenging issue in 3 panels with highly significant contributions from all academic flora and from think tanks, and also from diplomats as well. I think all these arguments, discussions, and papers or proceedings will pave the way for other developments for academics and policymakers as well. So thanks for all the participants to this nice event, and meet you all for the next one during the 4th Security Conference in the next year, I hope. Take care. Greetings from all ours.